The day had started with so much promise, a rare morning when the weather was perfect, the sun not too hot, and the ocean breeze carrying the salty smell of freedom, the kind that always made Michael feel alive. Michael, my 14-year-old son, had been born with a severe spinal condition that left him paralyzed from the waist down, confined to his wheelchair. But never once had he let it confine his spirit. For weeks, he had begged me to take him to the beach again, saying he wanted to feel the sand under his hands, to listen to the crashing waves up close, and to just exist like every other kid his age without the constant stares of pity. I finally gave in, packing his chair, his favorite red cap, and a cooler of snacks, determined to give him the day he deserved. The beach was public property, open to everyone, but as we rolled his wheelchair closer to the shoreline, I noticed the stares. Some families smiled warmly, nodding at us with encouragement, while others gave those quick, darting looks, the kind that said more than words ever could. Still, I ignored them, focusing only on Michael's grin as he scooped up a handful of sand and laughed at the way it slipped through his fingers. It was supposed to be our moment, a memory carved into time, but then she appeared. Her name was Karen. Though I didn't know it yet, a middle-aged woman in a wide-brimmed sun hat and expensive sunglasses, the kind of person who seemed to think the beach belonged to her and her alone. She marched across the sand toward us, clutching a phone in one hand and a tote bag in the other, her lips twisted in disgust. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the waves. "What are you doing here? This isn't some rehabilitation center. People are here to relax, not to feel uncomfortable." I blinked in disbelief, unsure if I'd heard her right, but before I could reply, Michael, always braver than I gave him credit for, said calmly, "I just wanted to see the ocean." Karen sneered, rolling her eyes. "Well, you're out of place here. This is a family beach, not a pity show." I could feel my blood boiling, but I forced myself to stay calm, for Michael's sake. "This is a public beach," I reminded her firmly, "and my son has every right to enjoy it like anyone else." But she wasn't listening. Instead, she pulled something from her tote bag that made my stomach drop. A gun. For a second, my brain refused to process it. Who brings a gun to the beach? But before I could react, she raised it, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she hissed, "You don't belong here. He doesn't belong here." Time seemed to freeze. The laughter of children in the distance turned into a dull, muffled echo. The waves crashing against the shore became a faraway roar, and all I could see was the barrel of that gun pointed at my son. Michael looked at me, his eyes wide, his mouth trembling as though he wanted to say something but couldn't. I lunged forward, screaming for help, but the sound of the gunshot tore through the air before I could reach him. The blast echoed across the beach, sending birds scattering into the sky and people shrieking in horror. Michael jerked in his chair, a cry escaping his lips as blood began to seep through his shirt. My knees buckled, the sand swallowing me whole as I fell beside him, my shaking hands trying to stop the bleeding. People were running now, some screaming, some filming with their phones, others frozen in shock. Karen stood there, her chest heaving, as if she had just done something righteous. "I told you he didn't belong," she muttered coldly, lowering the gun as though she had simply swatted a fly. Rage like I had never known surged through me, but it was drowned by terror as I pressed my hands against Michael's wound. His voice was faint, trembling. "Mom, I just wanted the ocean." Tears blurred my vision, my heart breaking into shards. This was supposed to be a perfect day, a memory to cherish, but instead, it had become a nightmare that would change everything forever. The tension in the air grew heavier with each passing second as Karen's voice rose above the calm rhythm of the waves, her accusations piercing through the peaceful atmosphere of the beach like shards of broken glass. She stood there, hands on her hips, her face twisted with indignation, as if my son simply being present was a crime against her existence. "This is private property," she screeched, her finger jabbing toward the sand beneath our feet. "Wheelchairs don't belong here. People come here to relax, not to look at that." Her words were venom, laced with cruelty, and every syllable sliced into me deeper than a knife ever could. My son, brave as he always tried to be, shrank into his chair, his small hands gripping the armrests tightly, his eyes glistening with tears he refused to let fall. He whispered to me, "Mom, can we just go?" But my heart rebelled against the idea of running away again, of letting this woman dictate where my child was or was not allowed to exist. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but firm, telling her that this was a public beach, that she had no authority to decide who could enjoy the sand or the sea. But Karen only laughed, a cold, shrill sound that made bystanders stop and watch. People began pulling out their phones, some whispering, others frozen, unsure if they should step in. Karen's hostility escalated. She began shouting about neighborhood standards, ranting about how she paid good money for her HOA fees to keep eyesores like us away. Each word dripped with hatred, a twisted sense of superiority that made my blood boil. I could feel the crowd around us growing, some with sympathetic expressions, others nodding in uncomfortable agreement with her bigoted claims. My son's breathing quickened, fear tightening his chest, and I knelt beside him, stroking his arm to comfort him. "You don't have to be afraid," I whispered, even though inside I was terrified. Then Karen crossed the line, literally and figuratively, when she stormed toward us, pulling something shiny from her oversized purse. At first, I thought it was a phone, but the glint of steel under the sun told me otherwise. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Karen raised a small pistol, her voice venomous as she screamed that my son didn't belong there, that he was ruining the view. My heart nearly stopped. My body froze between the instinct to shield my child and the paralyzing shock of seeing a weapon pointed at him over something so absurd, so vile. People shouted for her to stop, some running toward her, others running away. Time slowed in that horrifying moment. My son clutched my hand, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Mom, I'm scared." I held him close, whispering, "I won't let anything happen to you." But my eyes were locked on Karen's trembling finger hovering over the trigger. The situation had spiraled from words into a nightmare of violence, and as the first wail of a siren echoed faintly in the distance, I realized we had only seconds before the standoff turned into tragedy. The shrill wail of sirens cut through the salty air, mingling with the panicked murmurs of the crowd that had gathered around my son's wheelchair, now tilted slightly from the impact of Karen's bullet. I knelt beside him, my hands trembling as I pressed a beach towel against his side, begging him to hold on, whispering promises that everything would be okay even though fear choked me. His wide, tear-filled eyes locked on mine, silently asking if he was going to die, and that look alone nearly shattered me. When the police finally arrived, 2 officers ran toward us, but instead of rushing to help my bleeding son, their eyes immediately landed on Karen, who stood with the smoking gun still in her hand. To my horror, she was the first to speak, calmly, confidently, as though she were the victim. "Officer," she cried, pointing at my son, "this boy doesn't belong here. He was threatening me. I had to protect myself." Her words slashed through the chaos like poison, and I watched in disbelief as the officers, instead of disarming her, began nodding along like she had any right to frame this nightmare as self-defense. I screamed at them, my voice breaking. "She shot my son. He's disabled. Look at him." He wasn't threatening anyone, but they silenced me with sharp glares, and one officer even raised his hand as if to warn me to step back. Bystanders shouted from behind the tape, their voices filled with outrage. "That boy never touched her. She's lying." But it was as though the police had selective hearing, tuning out every truth that contradicted Karen's twisted version. My son whimpered as the towel soaked through with more blood, and I screamed again for an ambulance, desperate for anyone to prioritize his life over Karen's lies. Finally, a paramedic team pushed through, kneeling beside him, working quickly to stabilize him as they muttered words like low blood pressure and possible internal damage, terms that made my heart slam against my ribs. Still, the police hovered more around Karen than my son, gently taking the gun from her hand, treating her like a misunderstood neighbor rather than a shooter who had just almost murdered a child. I felt my stomach twist in rage as one officer approached me, his tone dismissive. "Ma'am, calm down. We're investigating both sides here. If your boy had provoked her, I nearly lunged at him, fury surging, but a paramedic grabbed my shoulder, whispering, "Your son needs you focused. Stay with him." My hands shook as I brushed my son's damp hair from his forehead, whispering over and over, "You're gonna be okay, baby. Mommy's here. Hold on." And all the while, Karen stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, smirking like she already knew the system would shield her, not us. That moment burned itself into my soul, the realization that the fight wasn't only to save my son's life, but to fight a system ready to excuse the woman who tried to take it away. The day of the trial arrived like a storm that everyone had seen brewing for months, yet no one was prepared for the way it would shake the town to its core. The courthouse was packed, not only with lawyers, reporters, and townspeople, but with activists from disability rights groups, parents who had their own stories of discrimination, and veterans who had come to stand with me and my son Daniel. The weight of the eyes in that room pressed down on us as we sat in the front row, Daniel's wheelchair polished clean, his head held high despite the anxiety written across his face. Karen sat across the aisle with her attorney, her expression swinging wildly between smug entitlement and feigned victimhood. She wore a pastel dress, as if she wanted to appear as a kind grandmother, but the venom in her eyes betrayed her. When the judge entered, the hush that fell over the courtroom was like the sudden silence before thunder cracks. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. How Daniel was enjoying a sunny day at the beach, how Karen had called him out of place, how she had pulled the trigger on a gun she should never have been carrying, and how my son's blood had stained the sand where children should have been building castles. They showed photos of Daniel in the hospital bed, tubes running across his body, his young face pale and bruised, and the jury flinched. Some covered their mouths. Others glared at Karen, who rolled her eyes as though she were inconvenienced by it all. Her defense attorney argued that she felt threatened, that Daniel's wheelchair had made her suspicious because she didn't recognize him as belonging to the community, as if a chair with wheels was somehow a weapon, as if my son's presence near the water was an act of violence. The audacity of it left me trembling, my hands clenched so tightly that my nails cut into my palms. Then came my turn on the stand. My voice cracked as I described that moment when the sound of a gunshot shattered the waves, how I saw my boy fall forward in his chair, his scream mixing with the cries of terrified families. I spoke of the months in the hospital, the surgeries, the nights Daniel whispered, "Mom, will I ever be safe again?" My testimony was raw, painful, and unfiltered, and I could see tears running down the faces of strangers in the gallery. When Daniel himself was wheeled to the stand, the room stilled completely. His voice was shaky, but he spoke with a courage that only comes from surviving something no child should endure. He told them he had just wanted to see the ocean sparkle, to feel normal, to be a part of the world for a little while, and that Karen had stolen that from him. His words pierced the jury, and even the judge's stoic expression softened. Karen, however, muttered under her breath, loud enough for a microphone to catch, "He's just milking this for attention." The courtroom gasped, reporters scribbled furiously, and her own lawyer buried his face in his hands. The prosecution closed with fiery words about accountability, about community, and about how society cannot tolerate hatred masquerading as fear. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, but as we waited, my heart pounded with both dread and hope. I held Daniel's hand, whispering, "No matter what happens, you are already stronger than her." Hours later, when the jury returned, the foreman stood tall and announced, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all charges." Gasps and cheers erupted. Karen's mouth dropped open, her mask of arrogance crumbling as reality hit her like a tidal wave. The judge, with a stern voice, announced that she would face a sentence that reflected not only her crime, but her cruelty. As Daniel and I embraced, the weight I had carried for months lifted slightly, though I knew the scars on my son's body and heart would remain forever. Justice had spoken, but the fight for healing was just beginning. The courthouse was packed with people, reporters filling every seat, their cameras ready to capture the moment. The air was thick with tension, and every glance thrown toward Karen carried the weight of anger and disbelief. She sat in her pressed blazer, lips curled in the same arrogance she wore on the beach that day, as though she were the victim, not the woman who had nearly taken a boy's life. On the other side of the room, I sat with my son, his wheelchair slightly angled, so he could see the front clearly. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a quiet determination that made my chest ache with pride. The judge entered, and silence swept across the room like a heavy wave. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the case, presenting the footage of Karen shouting at us on the beach, pulling the gun, and firing. The video froze mid-frame, the image of her finger pulling the trigger glaring across the courtroom screens, and gasps rippled through the audience. Karen's lawyer stammered, through weak defenses, claiming she acted out of fear and confusion, but every word rang hollow against the evidence. Then came the moment I dreaded and anticipated. My son was called to the stand. The entire courtroom leaned forward as he rolled himself to the witness box, his small hands gripping the wheels with strength born of necessity. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, he grew steady, describing not only the day of the shooting, but the countless times people had made him feel unwanted simply because of his chair. "I just wanted to see the ocean like everyone else," he said softly, and you could have heard a pin drop. Reporters lowered their cameras, jurors dabbed their eyes, and even the judge leaned forward, visibly shaken. My son's words weren't just testimony, they were truth carved deep into the conscience of every person listening. For the first time, Karen shifted uncomfortably, her smug mask cracking as she realized the world was seeing her for what she truly was. In that moment, I knew we weren't just fighting for justice in this courtroom. We were fighting for every child, every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And my son, sitting tall in his wheelchair, was leading the charge. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air heavy with tension as my family sat at the plaintiff's table, our attorney speaking with quiet determination as he laid out the facts of what HOA Karen had done. The prosecution painted the picture clearly. An innocent disabled boy, my son, who had done nothing but enjoy a sunny day at the beach, was left fighting for his life because of one woman's prejudice and rage. Across from us, Karen sat with her legal team, her face twisted with arrogance, still convinced she was the victim in all this. She had claimed in her police statement that my son looked suspicious and that his wheelchair made him seem out of place at the private beach. The audacity of her words made the courtroom erupt in gasps, and even the judge shook his head in disbelief. When it was time for witnesses, the truth came crashing down like waves on the shore. Beachgoers testified that Karen had been shouting hateful things at us long before she pulled the trigger. Others revealed how she had a history of harassing families and targeting anyone she deemed unworthy of her neighborhood. Then came the hardest moment. I was called to the stand. My hands trembled as I recounted the sound of the gunshot, the sight of my son's blood staining the sand, and the desperate ride in the ambulance where I feared I'd lose him forever. The jury's eyes glistened with tears. Even the bailiff turned away to compose himself. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that she had acted out of fear for her safety, but the evidence was too overwhelming. There was no weapon, no threat, just a disabled child enjoying his day. Finally, when the judge asked if Karen wanted to speak, she stood and launched into another tirade about keeping the community safe, her words dripping with the same venom that had fueled her actions. That was the final nail in the coffin. Her lack of remorse sealed her fate. As the gavel struck, the charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and hate crime enhancements were confirmed, and Karen's face drained of color. For the first time, she realized the walls she had built with arrogance and cruelty were closing in, and there was no escape. The courtroom was filled to the brim on the day of Karen's sentencing, and the air carried a tense silence, broken only by the soft rustle of papers and hushed whispers. Cameras lined the back wall as reporters prepared to capture the verdict in a case that had shocked the nation. My son sat beside me in his wheelchair, his hands folded nervously in his lap, while I kept my arm firmly around his shoulders, silently reminding him that no matter what happened, he was never alone. Across the room, Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her eyes darting around, looking less like the arrogant woman who once claimed my son looked out of place, and more like someone who finally realized the world no longer revolved around her cruelty. The judge's gavel struck, and the murmurs died down instantly. Karen Miller, the judge began, his voice steady and unwavering. This court finds you guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and hate-motivated violence. My heart pounded as the words echoed through the room, and for the first time in months, I felt a weight begin to lift from my chest. Karen's face drained of color as the judge continued, sentencing her to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the first 10. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and though Karen opened her mouth as if to protest, the bailiff's firm grip silenced her. She was escorted out, her once sharp voice replaced with a hollow silence that felt like justice finally breathing through the walls. My son squeezed my hand, his voice trembling but filled with relief as he whispered, "Mom, we won." I bent down, kissed his forehead, and whispered back, "No, sweetheart, we didn't just win. We prove that your life matters, your voice matters, and no one will ever take that from you again." Outside, reporters swarmed us, microphones and cameras flashing. But for once, I didn't mind the chaos. I looked into the cameras and spoke not just as a mother, but as a fighter. This isn't just about my son. It's about every disabled person who's been overlooked, mistreated, or told they don't belong. My son belongs. They all belong. And today, justice belongs to us. The crowd erupted into applause, strangers cheering not just for the verdict, but for the message it carried. As I wheeled my son out into the sunlight, I felt a sense of peace knowing Karen would spend her years behind bars, while my son's life, his bright, unstoppable life, was finally free from her shadow. For the first time in a long time, we could finally breathe.